Section 20 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 6, Renaissance and Reformation, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. John Calvin, Part 3. And here I would remark that theologians and philosophers have ever been divided into two great schools: those who have had a tendency to exalt the dignity of man, and those who would absorb man in the greatness of the deity. These two schools have advocated doctrines which, logically carried out to their ultimate sequences, would produce a Grecian humanitarianism on the one hand, and a sort of Brahmanism on the other, the one making man the arbiter of his own destiny, independently of divine agency, and the other making the deity the only power of the universe. With one school, God as the only controlling agency is a fiction, and man himself is infinite in faculties; the other holds that God is everything and man is nothing. The distinction between these two schools, both of which have had great defenders, is fundamental, such as that between Augustine and Pelagius, between Bernard and Abelard, and between Calvin and Lainez. Among those who have inclined to the doctrine of the majesty of God and the littleness of man were the primitive monks and the Indian theosophists, and the orthodox scholastics of the Middle Ages, all of whom were comparatively indifferent to material pleasure and physical progress, and sought the salvation of the soul and the favor of God beyond all temporal blessings. Of the other class have been the Greek philosophers and the rationalizing schoolmen and the modern lights of science. Now Calvin was imbued with the lofty spirit of the fathers of the Church, and the more religious and contemplative of the schoolmen and the saints of the Middle Ages, when he attached but little dignity to man unaided by divine grace, and was absorbed with the idea of the sovereignty of God, in whose hands man is like clay in the hands of the potter. This view of God pervaded the whole spirit of his theology, making it both lofty and yet one-sided. To him the chief end of man was to glorify God, not to develop his own intellectual faculties, and still less to seek the pleasures and excitements of the world. Man was a sinner before an infinite God, and he could rise above the polluting influence of sin only by the special favor of God and his divinely communicated grace. Man was so great a sinner that he deserved an eternal punishment, only to be rescued as a brand plucked from the fire, as one of the elect before the world was made. The vast majority of men were left to the uncovenanted mercies of Christ, the Redeemer, not of the race, but of those who believed. To Calvin, therefore, as to the Puritans, the belief in a personal God was everything, not a compulsory belief in the general existence of a deity who, united with nature, reveals himself to our consciousness, not the God of the pantheist, visible in all the wonders of nature, not the God of the rationalist, who retires from the universe which he has made, leaving it to the operation of certain unchanging and universal laws, but the God whom Abraham and Moses and the prophets saw and recognized, and who by his special providence rules the destinies of men. The most intellectual of the reformers abhorred the deification of the reason, and clung to that exalted supernaturalism which was the life and hope of blessed saints and martyrs in bygone ages, and which in their contests with mail-clad infidelity was like the pebble which the shepherd of Israel hurled against the disdainful boaster who defied the power of Israel's God. And he was thus brought into close sympathy with the realism of the fathers, who felt that all that is valuable in theology must radiate from the recognition of almighty power in the renovation of society, and displayed, not according to our human notions of law and progress and free will, but supernaturally and mysteriously according to his sovereign will, which is above law, since God is the author of law. He simply erred in enforcing a certain class of truths which must follow from the majesty of the one great first cause, lofty as those truths are, to the exclusion of another class of truths of great importance, which gives to his system incompleteness and one-sidedness. Thus he was led to undervalue the power of truth itself in its contest with error. He was led into a seeming recognition of two wills in God, that which wills the salvation of all men, and that which wills the salvation of the elect alone. He is accused of a leaning to fatalism, which he heartily denied, but which seems to follow from his logical conclusions. He entered into an arena of metaphysical controversy which can never be settled. The doctrines of free will and necessity can never be reconciled by mortal reason. Consciousness reveals the freedom of the will as well as the slavery to sin. Men are conscious of both. They waste their time in attempting to reconcile two apparently opposing facts, like our pious fathers at their New England firesides, who were compelled to shelter themselves behind mystery. The tendency of Calvin's system, it is maintained by many, is to ascribe to God attributes which according to natural justice would be injustice and cruelty, such as no father would exercise on his own children, however guilty. Even good men will not accept in their hearts doctrines which tend to make God less compassionate than man. There are not two kinds of justice. The intellect is appalled when it is affirmed that one man justly suffers the penalty of another man's sin, although the world is full of instances of men suffering from the carelessness or wickedness of others, as in a wicked war or an unnecessary railway disaster. The Scripture law of retribution, as brought out in the Bible and sustained by consciousness, is the penalty a man pays for personal and voluntary transgression. Nor will consciousness accept the doctrine that the sin of a mortal, especially under strong temptation and with all the bias of a sinful nature, is infinite. Nothing which a created mortal can do is infinite. It is only finite. The infinite belongs to God alone. Hence, an infinite penalty for a finite sin conflicts with a consciousness and is nowhere asserted in the Bible, which is transcendently more merciful and comforting than many theological systems of belief, however powerfully sustained by dialectical reason and by the most excellent men. Human judgments or reasonings are fallible on moral questions which have two sides, and reasonings from texts which present different meanings when studied by the lights of learning and science are still more liable to be untrustworthy. It would seem to be the supremest necessity for theological schools to unravel the meaning of divine declarations and present doctrines in their relation with apparently conflicting texts, rather than draw out a perfect and consistent system, philosophically considered, from any one class of texts. Of all things in this wicked and perplexing world, the science of theology should be the most cheerful and inspiring, for it involves inquiries on the loftiest subjects which can interest a thoughtful mind. But whatever defects the system of doctrines which Calvin elaborated with such transcendent ability may have, there is no question as to its vast influence on the thinking of the 16th and 17th centuries. The schools of France and Holland and Scotland and England and America were animated by his genius and authority. He was a burning and a shining light, if not for all ages, at least for the unsettled times in which he lived. No theologian ever had a greater posthumous power than he for nearly 300 years, and he is still one of the great authorities of the Church universal. John Knox sought his counsel and was influenced by his advice in the great reform he made in Scotland. In France, the words Calvinist and Huguenot are synonymous. Cranmer, too, listened to his counsels and had great respect for his learning and sanctity. Among the Puritans he has reigned like an oracle. Oliver Cromwell embraced his doctrines, as did Sir Matthew Hale. Ridicule or abuse of Calvin is as absurd as the ridicule or abuse with which Protestants so long assailed Hildebrand or Innocent III. No one abuses Pascal or Augustine, yet the theological views of all these are substantially the same. In one respect I think that Calvin has received more credit than he deserves. Some have maintained that he was a sort of father of republicanism and democratic liberty. In truth he had no popular sympathy, and leaned towards an aristocracy which was little short of an oligarchy. He had no hand in establishing the political system of Geneva. It was established before he went there. He was not even one of those thinkers who sympathized with true liberty of conscience. He persecuted heretics like a medieval Catholic divine. He would have burned a Galileo as he caused the death of Servetus, which need not have happened but for him. Calvin could have saved Servetus if he had pleased, but he complained of him to the magistrates, knowing that his condemnation and death would necessarily follow. He had neither the humanity of Luther nor the toleration of St. Augustine. He was the impersonation of intellect, like Newton, Leibniz, Spinoza, and Kant, which overbore the impulses of his heart. He had no passions except zeal for orthodoxy. So preeminently did intellect tower above the passions that he seemed to lack sympathy, and yet, such was his exalted character, he was capable of friendship. He was remarkable for every faculty of the mind except wit and imagination. His memory was almost incredible. He remembered everything he ever read or heard. He would, after long intervals, recognize persons whom he had never seen but once or twice. When employed in dictation, he would resume the thread of his discourse without being prompted, after the most vexatious interruptions. His judgment was as sound as his memory was retentive. It was almost infallible. No one was ever known to have been misled by it. He had a remarkable analytical power, and also the power of generalization. He was a very learned man, and his commentaries are among the most useful and valued of his writings, showing both learning and judgment. His exegetical works have scarcely been improved. He had no skeptical or rationalistic tendencies, and therefore his commentaries may not be admired by men of advanced thought, but his annotations will live when those of Ewald shall be forgotten. They still hold their place in the libraries of biblical critics. For his age he was a transcendent critic; his various writings fill 5 folio volumes. He was not so voluminous a writer as Thomas Aquinas, but less diffuse; his style is lucid, like that of Voltaire. Considering the weakness of his body, Calvin's labors were prodigious. There was never a more industrious man, finding time for everything, for an amazing correspondence, for pastoral labors, for treatises and essays, for commentaries and official duties. No man ever accomplished more in the same space of time. He preached daily every alternate week; he attended meetings of the consistory and of the court of morals; he interested himself in the great affairs of his age; he wrote letters to all parts of Christendom. Reigning as a religious dictator, and with more influence than any man of his age next to Luther, Calvin was content to remain poor, and was disdainful of money and all praises and rewards. This was not an affectation, not the desire to imitate the great saints of Christian antiquity, to whom poverty was a cardinal virtue, but real indifference, looking upon money as impedimenta, as camp equipage is to successful generals. He was not conscious of being poor, with his small salary of $50 a year, feeling that he had inexhaustible riches within him, and hence he calmly and naturally took his seat among the great men of the world as their peer and equal, without envy of the accidents of fortune and birth. He was as indifferent to money and luxuries as Socrates when he walked barefooted among the Athenian aristocracy, or Basil when he retired to the wilderness. He rarely gave vent to extravagant grief or joy, seldom laughed, and cared little for hilarities. He knew no games or sports; he rarely played with children or gossiped with women; he loved without romance, and suffered bereavement without outward sorrow. He had no toleration for human infirmities, and was neither social nor genial. He sought a wife, not so much for communion of feeling as to ease him of his burdens; not to share his confidence, but to take care of his house. Nor was he fond, like Luther, of music and poetry. He had no taste for the fine arts. He never had a poet or an artist for his friend or companion. He could not look out of his window without seeing the glaciers of the Alps, but seemed to be unmoved by their unspeakable grandeur. He did not revel in the glories of nature or art, but gave his mind to abstract ideas and stern practical duties. He was sparing of language, simple, direct, and precise, using neither sarcasm nor ridicule nor exaggeration. He was far from being eloquent according to popular notions of oratory, and despised the jingle of words and phrases and tricks of rhetoric. He appealed to reason rather than the passions, to the conscience rather than the imagination. Though mild, Calvin was also intolerant. Castillo, once his friend, assailed his doctrine of decrees, and was obliged to quit Geneva, and was so persecuted that he died of actual starvation. Perrin, captain general of the Republic, danced at a wedding, and was thrown into prison. Bolsec, an eminent physician, opposed the doctrine of predestination, and was sentenced to perpetual imprisonment. Gruet spoke lightly of the ordinances of religion, and was beheaded. Servetus was a moral and learned and honest man, but he could not escape the flames. Had he been willing to say, as the flames consumed his body, "Jesus, thou eternal Son of God, have mercy on me," instead of "Jesus, thou Son of the eternal God," he might have been spared. Calvin was as severe on those who refused to accept his logical deductions from acknowledged truths as he was on those who denied the fundamental truths themselves. But toleration was rare in his age, and he was not beyond it. He was not even beyond the ideas of the Middle Ages in some important points, such as those which pertain to divine justice, the wrath rather than the love of God. He lived too near the Middle Ages to be emancipated from the ideas which enslaved such a man as Thomas Aquinas. He had very little patience with frivolous amusements or degrading pursuits. He attached great dignity to the ministerial office, and set a severe example of decorum and propriety in all his public ministrations. He was a type of the early evangelical divines, and was the father of the old Puritan strictness and narrowness and fidelity to trusts. His very faults grew out of virtues pushed to extremes. In our times such a man would not be selected as a traveling companion, or a man at whose house we would wish to keep the Christmas holidays. His unattractive austerity perhaps has been made too much of by his enemies, and grew out of his unimpulsive temperament, call it cold if we must, and also out of his stern theology, which marked the ascetics of the Middle Ages. Few would now approve of his severity of discipline any more than they would feel inclined to accept some of his theological deductions. I question whether Calvin lived in the hearts of his countrymen, or they would have erected some monument to his memory. In our times a statue has been erected to Rousseau in Geneva, but Calvin was buried without seminary and with exceeding simplicity. He was a warrior who cared nothing for glory or honor, absorbed in devotion to his invisible king, not indifferent to the exercise of power, but only as he felt he was the delegated messenger of divine omnipotence, scattering to the winds the dust of all mortal grandeur. With all his faults which were on the surface, he was the accepted idol and oracle of a great party, and stamped his genius on his own and succeeding ages. Whatever the Presbyterians have done for civilization, he comes in for a share of the honor. Whatever foundations the Puritans laid for national greatness in this country, it must be confessed that they caught inspiration from his decrees. Such a great master of exegetical learning and theological inquiry and legislative wisdom will be forever held in reverence by lofty characters, although he may be no favorite with the mass of mankind. If many great men and good men have failed to comprehend either his character or his system, how can a pleasure-loving and material generation, seeking to combine the glories of this world with the promises of the next, see much in him to admire, except as a great intellectual dialectician and system-maker in an age with which it has no sympathy? How can it appreciate his deep spiritual life, his profound communion with God, his burning zeal for the defense of Christian doctrine, his sublime self-sacrifice, his holy resignation, his entire consecration to a great cause? Nobody can do justice to Calvin who does not know the history of his times, the circumstances which surrounded him, and the enemies he was required to fight. No one can comprehend his character or mission who does not feel it to be supremely necessary to have a definite, positive system of rigorous belief, based on the authority of the Scriptures as a divine inspiration, both as an anchor amid the storms and a star of promise and hope. And, after all, what is the head and front of Calvin's offending? That he was cold, unsocial, and ungenial in character, and that, as a theologian, he fearlessly and inexorably pushed out his deductions to their remotest logical sequences. But he was no more austere than Chrysostom, no more ascetic than Basil, not even sterner in character than Michelangelo, or more unsocial than Pascal or Cromwell or William the Silent. We lose sight of his defects in the greatness of his services and the exalted dignity of his character. If he was severe to adversaries, he was kind to friends; and when his feeble body was worn out by his protracted labors, at the age of 53, and he felt that the hand of death was upon him, he called together his friends and fellow laborers in reform, the magistrates and ministers of Geneva, imparted his last lessons, and expressed his last wishes with the placidity of a Christian sage. Amid tears and sobs and stifled groans, he discoursed calmly on his approaching departure, gave his affectionate benedictions, and commended them and his cause to Christ, lingering longer than was expected, but dying in the highest triumphs of Christian faith, May 27, 1564, in the arms of his faithful and admiring Beza, as the rays of the setting sun gilded with their glory his humble chamber of toil and spiritual exaltation. No man who knows anything will ever sneer at Calvin. He is not to be measured by common standards. He was universally regarded as the greatest light of the theological world. When we remember his transcendent abilities, his matchless labors, his unrivaled influence, his unblemished morality, his lofty piety, and soaring soul, all flippant criticism is contemptible and mean. He ranks with immortal benefactors, and needs least of all any apologies for his defects. A man who stamped his opinions on his own age and succeeding ages can be regarded only as a very extraordinary genius. A frivolous and pleasure-seeking generation may not be attracted by such an impersonation of cold intellect, and may rear no costly monument to his memory, but his work remains as the leader of the loftiest class of Christian enthusiasts that the modern world has known, and the founder of a theological system which still numbers, in spite of all the changes of human thought, some of the greatest thinkers and ablest expounders of Christian doctrine in both Europe and America. To have been the spiritual father of the Puritans for 300 years is itself a great evidence of moral and intellectual excellence, and will link his name with some of the greatest movements that have marked our modern civilization. From Plymouth Rock to the shores of the Pacific Ocean, we still see the traces of his marvelous genius, and his still more wonderful influence on the minds of men and on the schools of Christian theology, so that he will ever be regarded as the great doctor of the Protestant Church. Authorities: Henry's Life of Calvin, translated by Stebbings; Dyer's Life of Calvin; Beza's Life of Calvin; Drelincourt's Defense of Calvin; Bayle; Mainbourg's Histoire du Calvinisme; Calvin's Works; Rouchat; D'Aubigene's History of the Reformation; Burnet's Reformation, Mosheim, Biographie Universelle, Article on Servetus, Schlosser's Leben Bezas, McCree's Life of Knox, Original Letters, Parker Society. End of section 20. Section 21 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 6, Renaissance and Reformation, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Francis Bacon, Part 1. A.D. 1561 to 1626. The New Philosophy. It is not easy to present the life and labors of the wisest, brightest, meanest of mankind. So Pope sums up the character of the great Lord Bacon, as he is generally but improperly called, and this verdict, on the main, has been confirmed by Lords Macaulay and Campbell, who seem to delight in keeping him in that niche of the temple of fame where the poet has placed him, contemptible as a man, but venerable as the philosopher, radiant with all the wisdom of his age and of all the preceding ages, the miner and sapper of ancient falsehoods, the pioneer of all true knowledge, the author of that inductive and experimental philosophy on which is based the glory of our age. Macaulay, especially, in that long and brilliant article which appeared in the Edinburgh Review in 1837, has represented him as a remarkably worldly man, cold, calculating, selfish, a sycophant and a flatterer, bent on self-exaltation, greedy, careless, false, climbing to power by base subserviency, betraying friends and courting enemies, with no animosities he does not suppress from policy, and with no affections which he openly manifests when it does not suit his interests, so that we read with shame of his extraordinary shamelessness, from the time he first felt the cravings of a vulgar ambition to the consummation of a disgraceful crime, from the base desertion of his greatest benefactor to the public selling of justice as Lord High Chancellor of the realm, resorting to all the arts of a courtier to win the favor of his sovereign and of his minions and favorites, reckless as to honest debts, torturing on the rack an honest parson for a sermon he never preached, and, when obliged to confess his corruption, meanly supplicating mercy from the nation he had outraged, and favors from the monarch whose cause he had betrayed. The defects and delinquencies of this great man are bluntly and harshly put by Macaulay, without any attempt to soften or palliate them, as if he would consign his name and memory not to men's charitable speeches, to foreign nations, and to the next ages, but to an infamy as lasting and deep as that of Scroggs and of Jeffreys, or of any of those hideous tyrants and monsters that disgraced the reigns of the Stuart kings. And yet, while the man is made to appear in such hideous colors, his philosophy is exalted to the highest pinnacle of praise, as the greatest boon which any philosopher ever rendered to the world, and the chief cause of all subsequent progress in scientific discovery. And thus, in brilliant rhetoric, we have a painting of a man whose life was in striking contrast with his teachings, a Judas Iscariot uttering divine philosophy, a Seneca accumulating millions as the tool of Nero, a fallen angel, pointing with rapture to the realms of eternal light. We have the most startling contradiction in all history, glory in debasement, and debasement in glory, the most selfish and worldly man in England, the meanest of mankind, conferring on the race one of the greatest blessings it ever received, not accidentally, not in repentance and shame, but in exalted and persistent labors, amid public cares and physical infirmities, from youth to advanced old age, living in the highest regions of thought, studious and patient all his days, even when neglected and unrewarded for the transcendent services he rendered, not as a philosopher merely, but as a man of affairs and as a responsible officer of the crown. Has there ever been, before or since, such an anomaly in human history? So infamous in action, so glorious in thought? Such a contradiction between life and teachings, so that many are found to utter indignant protests against such a representation of humanity, justly feeling that such a portrait, however much it may be admired for its brilliant colors, and however difficult to be proved false, is nevertheless an insult to the human understanding. The heart of the world will not accept the strange and singular belief that so bad a man could confer so great a boon, especially when he seemed bent on bestowing it during his whole life amid the most harassing duties. If it accepts the boon, it will strive to do justice to the benefactor, as he himself appealed to future ages; and if it cannot deny the charges which have been arrayed against him, especially if it cannot exculpate him, it will soar beyond technical proofs to take into consideration the circumstances of the times, the temptations of a corrupt age, and the splendid traits which can, with equal authority, be adduced to set off against the mistakes and faults which proceeded from inadvertence and weakness rather than a debased moral sense. Even as the defects and weaknesses of Cicero are lost sight of in the acknowledged virtues of his ordinary life, and the honest and noble services he rendered to his country and mankind. Bacon was a favored man. He belonged to the upper ranks of society. His father, Sir Nicholas Bacon, was a great lawyer, and reached the highest dignities, being Lord Keeper of the Great Seal. His mother's sister was the wife of William Cecil, the great Lord Burleigh, the most able and influential of Queen Elizabeth's ministers. Francis Bacon was the youngest son of the Lord Keeper, and was born in London January 22nd, 1561. He had a sickly and feeble constitution, but intellectually was a youthful prodigy, and at 9 years of age, by his gravity and knowledge, attracted the admiring attention of the Queen, who called him her young Lord Keeper. At the age of 10 we find him stealing away from his companions to discover the cause of a singular echo in the brick conduit near his father's house in the Strand. At 12 he entered the University of Cambridge; at 15 he quitted it, already disgusted with its pedantries and sophistries. At 16 he rebelled against the authority of Aristotle, and took up his residence at Gray's Inn. In the same year, 1576, he was sent to Paris in the suite of Sir Amias Paulet, ambassador to the court of France, and delighted the salons of the capital by his wit and profound inquiries. At 19 he returned to England, having won golden opinions from the doctors of the French Sanhedrim, who saw in him a second Daniel; and in 1582 he was admitted as a barrister of Gray's Inn, and the following year composed an essay on the insaturation of philosophy. Thus at an age when young men now leave the university, he had attacked the existing systems of science and philosophy, proudly taking in all science and knowledge for his realm. About this time his father died, without leaving him, a younger son, a competence. Nor would his great relatives give him an office or sinecure by which he might be supported while he sought truth, and he was forced to plod at the law, which he never liked, resisting the blandishments and follies by which he was surrounded; and at intervals, when other young men of his age and rank were seeking pleasure, he was studying nature, science, history, philosophy, poetry, everything, even the whole domain of truth, and with such success that his varied attainments were rather a hindrance to an appreciation of his merits as a lawyer and his preferment in his profession. In 1586 he entered Parliament, sitting for Taunton, and also became a bencher at Gray's Inn, so that at 26 he was in full practice in the courts of Westminster, also a politician, speaking on almost every question of importance which agitated the House of Commons for 20 years, distinguished for eloquence as well as learning, and for a manly independence which did not entirely please the Queen, from whom all honors came. In 1591, at the age of 31, he formed the acquaintance of Essex, about his own age, who, as the favorite of the Queen, was regarded as the most influential man in the country. The acquaintance ripened into friendship, and to the solicitation of this powerful patron, who urged the Queen to give Bacon a high office. She is said to have replied, "He has indeed great wit and much learning, but in law, my lord, he is not deeply read," an opinion perhaps put into her head by his rival Coke, who did indeed know law but scarcely anything else, or by that class of old-fashioned functionaries who could not conceive how a man could master more than one thing. We should, however, remember that Bacon had not reached the age when great offices were usually conferred in the professions, and that his effort to be made Solicitor General at the age of 31, and even earlier, would now seem unreasonable and importunate, whatever might be his attainments. Disappointed in not receiving high office, he meditated a retreat to Cambridge, but his friend Essex gave him a villa in Twickenham, which he soon mortgaged, for he was in debt all his life, although in receipt of sums which would have supported him in comfort and dignity were it not for his habits of extravagance, the greatest flaw in his character, and which was the indirect cause of his disgrace and fall. He was even arrested for debt when he enjoyed a lucrative practice at the courts. But nothing prevented him from pursuing his literary and scientific studies, amid great distractions, for he was both a leader at the bar and a leader of the House of Commons, and if he did not receive the rewards to which he felt entitled, he was always consulted by Elizabeth in great legal difficulties. It was not until the Queen died and Bacon was 47 years old that he became Solicitor General (1607), in the 4th year of the reign of James, 1 year after his marriage with Alice Barnham, an alderman's daughter, a handsome maiden, and to his liking. Besides this office, which brought him £1,000 a year, he about this time had a windfall as Clerk of the Star Chamber, which added £2,000 to his income, at that time from all sources about £4,500 a year, a very large sum for those times, and making him really a rich man. 6 years afterward he was made Attorney General, and in the year 1617 he was made Lord Keeper, and the following year he was raised to the highest position in the realm, next to that of Archbishop of Canterbury, as Lord Chancellor, at the age of 57, and soon after was created Lord Verulam. That is his title, but the world persists in calling him Lord Bacon. In 1620, 2 years after the execution of Sir Walter Raleigh, which Bacon advised, he was in the zenith of his fortunes and fame, having been lately created Viscount St. Albans, and having published the Novum Organum, the first installment of the Insaturato Magna, at which he had been working the best part of his life, some 30 years, a new logic to judge or invent by induction, and thereby to make philosophy and science both more true and more active. Then began to gather the storms which were to wreck his fortunes. The nation was now clamorous for reform, and Coke, the enemy of Bacon, who was then the leader of the Reform party in the House of Commons, stimulated the movement. The House began its scrutiny with the administration of justice, and Bacon could not stand before it, for as the highest judge in England he was accused of taking bribes before rendering decisions, and of many cases of corruption so glaring that no defense was undertaken. And the House of Lords had no alternative but to sentence him to the Tower and fine him, to degrade him from his office, and banish him from the precincts of the court, a fall so great, and the impression of it on the civilized world so tremendous, that the case of a judge accepting bribes has rarely since been known. Bacon was imprisoned but a few days, his ruinous fine of £40,000 was remitted, and he was even soon after received at court, but he never again held office. He was hopelessly disgraced, he was a ruined man, and he bitterly felt the humiliation and acknowledged the justice of his punishment. He had now no further object in life than to pursue his studies, and live comfortably in his retirement, and do what he could for future ages. But before we consider his immortal legacy to the world, let us take one more view of the man, in order that we may do him justice and remove some of the cruel charges against him as the meanest of mankind. It must be borne in mind that from the beginning of his career until his fall, only 4 or 5 serious charges have been made against him: that he was extravagant in his mode of life, that he was a sycophant and office-seeker, that he deserted his patron Essex, that he tortured Peacham, a Puritan clergyman, when tried for high treason, that he himself was guilty of corruption as a judge. In regard to the first charge, it is unfortunately too true. He lived beyond his means, and was in debt most of his life. This defect, as has been said, was the root of much evil. It destroyed his independence, detracted from the dignity of his character, created enemies, and led to a laxity of the moral sense which prepared the way for corruption, thereby furnishing another illustration of that fatal weakness which degrades any man when he runs races with the rich, and indulges in a luxury and ostentation which he cannot afford. It was the curse of Cicero, of William Pitt, and of Daniel Webster. The first lesson which every public man should learn, especially if honored with important trusts, is to live within his income. However inconvenient and galling, a stringent economy is necessary. But this defect is a very common one, particularly when men are luxurious, or brought into intercourse with the rich, or inclined to be hospitable and generous, or have a great imagination and a sanguine temperament. So that those who are most liable to fall into this folly have many noble qualities to offset it, and it is not a stain which marks the meanest of mankind. Who would call Webster the meanest of mankind because he had an absurd desire to live like an English country gentleman? In regard to sycophancy, a disgusting trait, I admit, we should consider the age, when everybody cringed to sovereigns and their favorites. Bacon never made such an abject speech as Omer Talon, the greatest lawyer in France, did to Louis XIII. In the Parliament of Paris. 300 years ago, everybody bowed down to exalted rank. Witness the obsequious language which all authors addressed to patrons in the dedications of their books. How small the chance of any man rising in the world who did not court favors from those who had favors to bestow! Is that the meanest or the most uncommon thing in this world? If so, how ignominious are all politicians who flatter the people and solicit their votes! Is it not natural to be obsequious to those who have offices to bestow? This trait is not commendable, but is it the meanest thing we see? In regard to Essex, nobody can approve of the ingratitude which Bacon showed to his noble patron. But on the other hand, remembering the good advice which Bacon ever gave him, and his constant efforts to keep him out of scrapes, how often did he excuse him to his royal mistress at the risk of incurring her displeasure? And when Essex was guilty of 1,000 times worse crime than ever Bacon committed, even high treason, in a time of tumult and insurrection, and it became Bacon's task as prosecuting officer of the crown to bring this great culprit to justice, was he required by a former friendship to sacrifice his duty and his allegiance to his sovereign, to screen a man who had perverted the affection of the noblest woman who ever wore a crown, and came near involving his country in a civil war? Grant that Essex had bestowed favors and was an accomplished and interesting man. Was Bacon to ignore his official duties? He may have been too harsh in his procedure, but in that age all criminal proceedings were harsh and inexorable. There was but little mercy shown to culprits, especially to traitors. If Elizabeth could bring herself, out of respect to her wounded honor and slighted kindness and the dignity of the realm and the majesty of the law, to surrender into the hands of justice one whom she so tenderly loved and magnificently rewarded, even when the sacrifice cost her both peace and life, snapped the last cord which bound her to this world, may we not forgive Bacon for the part he played? Does this fidelity to an official and professional duty, even if he were harsh, make him the meanest of mankind? In regard to Peacham, it is true he was tortured according to the practice of that cruel age. But Bacon had no hand in the issuing of the warrant against him for high treason, although in accordance with custom he, as prosecuting officer of the crown, examined Peacham under torture before his trial. The parson was convicted, but the sentence of death was not executed upon him, and he died in jail. And in regard to corruption, the sin which cast Bacon from his high estate, though fortunately he did not fall like Lucifer, never to rise again, may not the verdict of the poet and the historian be rather exaggerated? Nobody has ever attempted to acquit Bacon for taking bribes. Nobody has ever excused him. He did commit a crime, but in palliation it might be said that he never decided against justice, and that it was customary for great public functionaries to accept presents. Had he taken them after he had rendered judgment instead of before, he might have been acquitted. For out of the 7,000 cases which he decided as Lord Chancellor, not one of them has been reversed, so that he has said of himself, "I was the justest judge that England has had for 50 years, and I suffered the justest sentence that had been inflicted for 200 years." He did not excuse himself. His ingenuousness of confession astonished everybody, and moved the hearts of his judges. It was his misfortune to be in debt. He had pressing creditors, and in 2 cases he accepted presents before the decision was made, but was brave enough to decide against those who bribed him. Hinc ilio lacrymo. A modern corrupt official generally covers his tracks, and many a modern judge has been bribed to decide against justice, and has escaped ignominy, even in a country which claims the greatest purity and the loftiest moral standard. We admit that Bacon was a sinner, but was he a sinner above all others who cast stones at Jerusalem? In reference to these admitted defects and crimes, I only wish to show that even these do not make him the meanest of mankind. What crimes have sullied many of those benefactors whom all ages will admire and honor, and whom, in spite of their defects, we call good men, not bad men to be forgiven for their services, but excellent and righteous on the whole. See Abraham telling lies to the king of Egypt, and Jacob robbing his brother of his birthright, and David murdering his bravest soldier to screen himself from adultery, and Solomon selling himself to false idols to please the wicked women who ensnared him, and Peter denying his master, and Marcus Aurelius persecuting the Christians, and Constantine putting to death his own son, and Theodosius slaughtering the citizens of Thessalonica, and Isabella establishing the Inquisition. and Sir Matthew Hale burning witches, and Cromwell stealing a sceptre, and Calvin murdering Servetus, and Queen Elizabeth lying and cheating and swearing in the midst of her patriotic labors for her country and civilization. Even the sun passes through eclipses. Have the spots upon the career of Bacon hidden the brightness of his general beneficence? Is he the meanest of men because he had great faults? When we speak of mean men, it is those whose general character is contemptible. End of section 21. Section 22 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 6, Renaissance and Reformation, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Francis Bacon, Part 2. Now, see Bacon pursuing his honorable career amid rebuffs and enmities and jealousies, toiling in Herculean tasks without complaint, and waiting his time, always accessible, affable, gentle, with no vulgar pride, if he aped vulgar ostentation, calm, beneficent, studious, without envy or bitterness, interesting in his home, courted as a friend, admired as a philosopher, generous to the poor, kind to the servants who cheated him, with an unsubdued love of nature as well as of books, not negligent of religious duties, a believer in God and immortality, and though broken in spirit, like a bruised reed, yet soaring beyond all his misfortunes to study the highest problems, and bequeathing his knowledge for the benefit of future ages. Can such a man be stigmatized as the meanest of mankind? Is it candid and just for a great historian to endorse such a verdict, to gloss over Bacon's virtues, and make, like an advocate at the bar or an ancient sophist, a special plea to magnify his defects, and stain his noble name with an infamy as deep as would be inflicted upon an enemy of the human race? And all for what? Just to make a rhetorical point, and show the writer's brilliancy and genius in making a telling contrast between the man and the philosopher? A man who habitually dwelt in the highest regions of thought during his whole life, absorbed in lofty contemplations, all from love of truth itself and to benefit the world, could not have had a mean or sordid soul. As a man thinketh, so is he. We admit that he was a man of the world, politic, self-seeking, extravagant, careless about his debts and how he raised money to pay them, but we deny that he was a bad judge on the whole, or was unpatriotic, or immoral in his private life, or mean in his ordinary dealings, or more cruel and harsh in his judicial transactions than most of the public functionaries of his rough and venal age. We admit it is difficult to controvert the charges which Macaulay arrays against him, for so accurate and painstaking an historian is not likely to be wrong in his facts, but we believe that they are uncandidly stated, and so ingeniously and sophistically put as to give on the whole a wrong impression of the man, making him out worse than he was, considering his age and circumstances. Bacon's character, like that of most great men, has two sides, and while we are compelled painfully to admit that he had many faults, we shrink from classing him among bad men, as is implied in Pope's characterization of him as the meanest of mankind. We now take leave of the man to consider his legacy to the world. And here again we are compelled to take issue with Macaulay, not in regard to the great fact that Bacon's inquiries tended to a new revelation of nature, and by means of the method called induction, by which he sought to establish fixed principles of science that could not be controverted, but in reference to the ends for which he labored. The aim of Bacon, says Macaulay, was utility, fruit, the multiplication of human enjoyments, the mitigation of human sufferings, the prolongation of life by new inventions. Dotare vitam humanum novis inventis et copiis. The conquest of nature. Dominion over the beasts of the field and the fowls of the air. The application of science to the subjection of the outward world. Progress in useful arts, in those arts which enable us to become strong, comfortable, and rich in houses, shops, fabrics, tools, merchandise, new vegetables, fruits, and animals. In short, a philosophy which will not raise us above vulgar wants, but will supply those wants. And as an acre in Middlesex is worth more than principality in Utopia, so the smallest practical good is better than any magnificent effort to realize an impossibility. And hence the first shoemaker has rendered more substantial service to mankind than all the sages of Greece. All they could do was to fill the world with long beards and long words, whereas Bacon's philosophy has lengthened life, mitigated pain, extinguished disease, built bridges, guided the thunderbolts, lightened the night with the splendor of the day, accelerated motion, annihilated distance, facilitated intercourse, enabled men to descend to the depths of the earth, to traverse the land in cars which whirl without horses, and the ocean in ships which sail against the wind. In other words, it was his aim to stimulate mankind, not to seek unattainable truth, but useful truth. That is, the science which produces railroads, canals, cultivated farms, ships, rich returns for labor, silver and gold from the mines, all that purchase the joys of material life and fit us for dominion over the world in which we live. Hence anything which will curtail our sufferings and add to our pleasures or our powers should be sought as the highest good. Geometry is desirable, not as a noble intellectual exercise, but as a handmaid to natural philosophy. Astronomy is not to assist the mind to lofty contemplations, but to enable mariners to verify degrees of latitude and regulate clocks. A college is not designed to train and discipline the mind, but to utilize science and become a school of technology. Greek and Latin exercises are comparatively worthless, and even mathematics, unless they can be converted into practical use. Philosophy, as ordinarily understood, that is, metaphysics, is most idle of all, since it does not pertain to mundane wants. Hence the old Grecian philosopher labored in vain, and still more profitless were the disquisitions of the scholastics of the Middle Ages, since they were chiefly used to prop up unintelligible creeds. Theology is not much of account, since it pertains to mysteries we cannot solve. It is not with heaven or hell, or abstract inquiries or divine certitudes that we have to do, but the things of earth, things that advance our material and outward condition. To be rich and comfortable is the end of life, not meditations on abstract and eternal truth, such as elevate the soul or prepare it for a future and endless life. The certitudes of faith, of love, of friendship, are of small value when compared with the blessings of outward prosperity. Utilitarianism is the true philosophy, for this confines us to the world where we are born to labor, and enables us to make acquisitions which promote our comfort and ease. The chemist and the manufacturer are our greatest benefactors, for they make for us oils and gases and paints, things we must have. The philosophy of Bacon is an immense improvement on all previous systems, since it heralds the jubilee of trades, of the millennium of merchants, the schools of thrift, the apostles of physical progress, the pioneers of enterprise, the Franklins and Stevensons and Tyndalls and Morses of our glorious era. Its watchword is progress. All hail, then, to the electric telegraph and telephones and Thames tunnels and Crystal Palaces and Niagara bridges and railways over the Rocky Mountains. The day of our deliverance has come. The nations are saved. The Brunels and Fieldses are our victors and leaders. Crown them with Olympic leaves as the heroes of our great games of life. And thou, O England, exalted art thou among the nations, not for thy Oxfords and Westminsters, not for thy divines and saints and martyrs and poets, not for thy Hookers and Leightons and Cranmers and Miltons and Burkes and Locks. Not for thy Reformation, not for thy struggles for liberty, but for thy Manchesters and Birminghams, thy Portsmouth shipyards, thy London docks, thy Liverpool warehouses, thy mines of coal and iron, thy countless mechanisms by which thou bringest the wealth of nations into thy banks, and art enabled to buy the toil of foreigners and to raise thy standards on the farthest battlements of India and China. These conquests and acquisitions are real, are practical. Machinery over life, the triumph of physical forces, dominion over waves and winds, these are the great victories which consummate the happiness of man, and these are they which flow from the philosophy which Bacon taught. Now Macaulay does not directly say all these things, but these are the spirit and gist of the interpretation which he puts upon Bacon's writings. The philosophy of Bacon leads directly to these blessings, and these constitute its great peculiarity. And it cannot be denied that the new era which Bacon heralded was fruitful in these very things, that his philosophy encouraged this new development of material forces. But it may be questioned whether he had not something else in view than merely utility and physical progress, and whether his method could not equally be applied to metaphysical subjects, whether it did not pertain to the whole domain of truth, and take in the whole realm of human inquiry. I believe that Bacon was interested, not merely in the world of matter, but in the world of mind, that he sought to establish principles from which sound deductions might be made, as well as to establish reliable inductions. Lord Campbell thinks that a perfect system of ethics could be made out of his writings, and that his method is equally well adapted to examine and classify the phenomena of the mind. He separated the legitimate paths of human inquiry, giving his attention to poetry and politics and metaphysics, as well as to physics. Bacon does not sneer, as Macaulay does, at the ancient philosophers. He bears testimony to their genius and their unrivaled dialectical powers, even if he regards their speculations as frequently barren. He does not flippantly ridicule the Homoousian and the Homoiousian as mere words, but the expression and exponent of profound theological distinctions, as every theologian knows them to be. He does not throw dirt on metaphysical science if properly directed, still less on noble inquiries after God and the mysteries of life. He is subjective as well as objective. He treats of philosophy in its broadest meaning, as it takes in the province of the understanding, the memory, and the will, as well as of men and society. He speaks of the principles of government and of the foundations of law, of universal justice, of eternal spiritual truth, so that Playfair judiciously observes, and he was a scientist, that it was not by sagacious anticipations of science, afterwards to be made in physics, that his writings have had so powerful an influence, as in his knowledge of the limits and resources of the human understanding. It would be difficult to find another writer, prior to Locke, whose works are enriched with so many just observations on mere intellectual phenomena. What he says of the laws of memory, of imagination, has never been surpassed in subtlety. No man ever more carefully studied the operation of his own mind and the intellectual character of others. Nor did Bacon despise metaphysical science, only the frivolous questions that the old scholastics associated with it, and the general barrenness of their speculations. He surely would not have disdained the subsequent inquiries of Locke, or Berkeley, or Leibniz, or Kant. True, he sought definite knowledge, something firm to stand upon, and which could not be controverted. No philosophy can be sound when the principle from which deductions are made is not itself certain or very highly probable, or when this principle, pushed to its utmost logical sequence, would lead to absurdity, or even to a conflict with human consciousness. To Bacon the old methods were wrong, and it was his primal aim to reform the scientific methods in order to arrive at truth. Not truth for utilitarian ends chiefly, but truth for its own sake. He loved truth as Palestrina loved music, or Raphael loved painting, or Socrates loved virtue. Now the method which was almost exclusively employed until Bacon's time is commonly called the deductive method. That is, some principle or premise was assumed to be true, and reasoning was made from this assumption. No especial fault was found with the reasoning of the great masters of logic like Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, for it never has been surpassed in acuteness and severity. If their premises were omitted, their conclusions would follow as a certainty. What was wanted was to establish the truth of premises, or general propositions. This, Bacon affirmed, could be arrived at only by induction, that is, the ascending from ascertained individual facts to general principles, by extending what is true of particulars to the whole class in which they belong. Bacon has been called the father of inductive science, since he would employ the inductive method. Yet he is not truly the father of induction, since it is as old as the beginnings of science. Hippocrates, when he ridiculed the quacks of his day, and collected the facts and phenomena of disease, and inferred from them the proper treatment of it, was as much the father of induction as Bacon himself. The error the ancients made was in not calling a sufficient number of facts to warrant a sound induction. And the ancients looked out for facts to support some preconceived theory, from which they reasoned syllogistically. The theory could not be substantiated by any syllogistic reasonings, since conclusions could never go beyond assumptions. If the assumptions were wrong, no ingenious or elaborate reasoning would avail anything toward the discovery of truth, but could only uphold what was assumed. This applied to theology as well as to science. In the Dark Ages, it was well for the teachers of mankind to uphold the dogmas of the Church, which they did with masterly dialectical skill. Those were ages of faith and not of inquiry. It was all important to ground believers in a firm faith of the dogmas which were deemed necessary to support the Church and the cause of religion. They were regarded as absolute certainties. There was no dispute about the premises of the scholastic's argument, and hence his dialectics strengthened the mind by the exercise of logical sports, and at the same time confirmed the faith. The world never saw a more complete system of dogmatic theology than that elaborated by Thomas Aquinas. When the knowledge of the Greek and Hebrew was rare and imperfect, and it was impossible to throw light by means of learning and science on the text of Scripture, It was well to follow the interpretation of such a great light as Augustine, and assume his dogmas as certainties, since they could not then be controverted, and thus from them construct a system of belief which would confirm the faith. But Aquinas, with his Aristotelian method of syllogism and definitions, could not go beyond Augustine. Augustine was the fountain, and the water that flowed from it in 10,000 channels could not rise above the spring; and as everybody appealed to and believed in Saint Augustine, it was well to construct a system from him to confute the heretical, and which the heretical would respect. The scholastic philosophy, which some ridicule, in spite of its puerilities and sophistries and syllogisms, preserved the theology of the Middle Ages, perhaps of the Fathers. It was a mighty bulwark of the faith, which was then accepted. No honors could be conferred on its great architects that were deemed extravagant. The Pope and the clergy saw in Thomas Aquinas the great defender of the Church, not of its abuses, but of its doctrines. And if no new light can be shed on the Scripture text from which assumptions were made, if these assumptions cannot be assailed, if they are certitudes, then we can scarcely have better textbooks than those furnished to the theologians of the Middle Ages, for no modern dialectician can excel them in severity of logic. The great object of modern theologians should be to establish the authenticity and meaning of the Scripture texts on which their assumptions rest. And this can be done only by the method which Bacon laid down, which is virtually a collation and collection of facts, that is, divine declarations. Establish the meaning of these without question, and we have Principia, from which we may deduce creeds and systems, the usefulness of which cannot be exaggerated, especially in an age of agnosticism. Having fundamental principles which cannot be gainsaid, we may philosophically draw deductions. Bacon did not make war on deduction, when its fundamental truths are established. Deduction is as much a necessary part of philosophy as induction. It is the peculiarity of the Scotch metaphysicians, who have ever deduced truths from those previously established. Deduction even enters into modern science as well as induction. When Cuvier deduced from a bone the form and habits of the mastodon, when Kepler deduced his great laws, all from the primary thought that there must be some numerical or geographical relation between the times, distances, and velocities of the revolving bodies of the solar system; when Newton deduced, as is said, the principle of gravitation from the fall of an apple; when Leverrier sought for a new planet from the perturbations of the heavenly bodies in their orbits, we feel that deduction is as much a legitimate process as induction itself. But deductive logic is the creation of Aristotle, and it was the authority of Aristotle that Bacon sought to subvert. The inductive process is also old, of which Bacon is called the father. How are these things to be reconciled and explained? Wherein and how did Bacon adapt his method to the discovery of truth, which was his principal aim, that method which is the great cause of any modern progress in science, the way to it being indicated by him preeminently? The whole thing consists in this, that Bacon pointed out the right road to truth, as a board where two roads meet or diverge indicates the one which is to be followed. He did not make a system, like Descartes or Spinoza or Newton. He showed the way to make it on sound principles. He laid down a systematic analysis and arrangement of inductive evidence. The syllogism, the great instrument used by Aristotle and the schoolmen, is, from its very nature, incompetent to prove the ultimate premises from which it proceeds, and when the truth of these remains doubtful, we can place no confidence in the conclusions drawn from them. Hence, the first step in the reform of science is to review its ultimate principles, and the first condition of a scientific method is that it shall be competent to conduct such an inquiry. And this method is applicable, not to physical science merely, but to the whole realm of knowledge. This, of course, includes poetry, art, intellectual philosophy, and theology, as well as geology and chemistry. And it is this breadth of inquiry directed to subjective as well as objective knowledge which made Bacon so great a benefactor. The defect in Macaulay's criticism is that he makes Bacon interested in mere outward phenomena, or matters of practical utility, a worldly utilitarian of whom Epicureans may be proud. In reality he soared to the realm of Plato as well as of Aristotle. Take, for instance, his Idola Mentis Humanae, or Phantoms of the Human Mind, which compose the best known part of the Novum Organum. The idols of the tribe would show the folly of attempting to penetrate farther than the limits of the human faculties permit, and also the liability of the intellect to be warped by the will and affections and the like. The idols of the den have reference to the tendencies to notice differences rather than resemblances, or resemblances rather than differences, in the attachment to antiquity or novelty, in the partiality to minute or comprehensive investigations. The idols of the marketplace have reference to the tendency to confound words with things, which has ever marked controversialists in their learned disputations. In what he here says about the necessity for accurate definitions, he reminds us of Socrates rather than a modern scientist. This necessity for accuracy applies to metaphysics as much as it does to physics. The idols of the theater have reference to perverse laws of demonstration, which are the strongholds of error. This school deals in speculations and experiments confined to a narrow compass, like those of the alchemists, too imperfect to elicit the light which should guide. End of section 22. Section 23 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 6, Renaissance and Reformation, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Francis Bacon, Part 3. Bacon, having completed his discussion of the Idola, then proceeds to point out the weakness of the old philosophies, which produced leaves rather than fruit, and were stationary in their character. Here he would seem to lean towards utilitarianism, were it not that he is as severe on men of experiment as on men of dogma. The men of experiment are, says he, like ants. They only collect and use. The reasoners resemble spiders, who make cobwebs out of their own substance. But the bee takes a middle course. It gathers the material from the flowers, but digests it by a power of its own. So true philosophy neither chiefly relies on the powers of the mind, nor takes the matter which it gathers and lays it up in the memory, whole as it finds it, but lays it up in the understanding, to be transformed and digested. Here he simply points out the laws by which true knowledge is to be attained. He does not extol physical science alone, though doubtless he had a preference for it over metaphysical inquiries. He was an Englishman, and the English mind is objective rather than subjective, and is prone to overvalue the outward and the seen, above the inward and unseen, and perhaps for the same reason that the Old Testament seems to make prosperity the greatest blessing, while adversity seems to be the blessing of the New Testament. One of Bacon's longest works is the Sylva Sylvarum, a sort of natural history, in which he treats of the various forces and productions of nature, the air, the sea, the winds, the clouds, plants and animals, fire and water, sounds and discords, colors and smells, heat and cold, disease and health; but which varied subjects he presents to communicate knowledge, with no especial utilitarian end. The Advancement of Learning is one of Bacon's most famous productions, but I fail to see in it an objective purpose to enable men to become powerful or rich or comfortable. It is rather an abstract treatise, as dry to most people as legal disquisitions, and with no more reference to rising in the world than Blackstone's Commentaries or Coke upon Littleton. It is a profound dissertation on the excellence of learning, its great divisions, treating of history, poetry, and philosophy, of metaphysical as well as physical philosophy, of the province of understanding, the memory, the will, the reason, and the imagination, and of man in society, of government, of universal justice, of the fountains of law, of revealed religion. And if we turn from the new method by which he would advance all knowledge, and on which his fame as a philosopher chiefly rests, that method which has led to discoveries that even Bacon never dreamed of, not thinking of the fruit he was to bestow, but the only way to secure it, even as a great inventor thinks more of his invention than of the money he himself may reap from it, as a work of creation to benefit the world rather than his own family, and in the work of which his mind revels in a sort of intoxicated delight, like a true poet when he constructs his lines, or a great artist when he paints his picture, a pure subjective joy, not an anticipated gain. If we turn from this method to most of his other writings, what do we find? Simply the lucubrations of a man of letters, the moral wisdom of the moralist, the historian, the biographer, the essayist. In these writings we discover no more worldliness than in Macaulay when he wrote his Milton, or Carlyle when he penned his Burns. Even less, for Bacon did not write to gain a living, but to please himself and give vent to his burning thoughts. In these he had no worldly aim to reach, except perhaps an imperishable fame. He wrote as Michelangelo sculptured his Moses, and he wrote not merely amid the cares and duties of a great public office, with other labors which might be called Herculean, but even amid the pains of disease and the infirmities of age, when rest, to most people, is the greatest boon and solace of their lives. Take his essays. These are among his best known works, so brilliant and forcible, suggestive and rich, that even Archbishop Whately's commentaries upon them are scarcely an addition. Surely these are not on material subjects, and indicate anything but a worldly or sordid nature. In these famous essays, so luminous with the gems of genius, we read not such worldly wise exhortations as Lord Chesterfield impressed upon his son, not the gossiping frivolities of Horace Walpole, not the cynical wit of Montaigne, but those great certitudes which console in affliction, which kindle hope, which inspire lofty resolutions, anchors of the soul, pillars of faith, sources of immeasurable joy, the glorious ideals of true objects of desire, the eternal unities of truth and love and beauty, all of which reveal the varied experiences of life and the riches of deeply pondered meditation on God and Christianity, as well as knowledge of the world and the desirableness of its valued gifts. How beautiful are his thoughts on death, on adversity, on glory, on anger, on friendship, on fame, on ambition, on envy, on riches, on youth and old age, and divers other subjects of moral import, which show the elevation of his soul, and the subjective as well as the objective turn of his mind; not dwelling on what he should eat and what he should drink, and wherewithal he should be clothed, but on the truths which appeal to our higher nature, and which raise the thoughts of men from earth to heaven, or at least to the realms of intellectual life and joy. And then it is necessary that we should take in view other labors which dignified Bacon's retirement, as well as those which marked his more active career as a lawyer and statesman, his histories and biographies, as well as learned treatises to improve the laws of England, his political discourses, his judicial charges, his theological tracts, his speeches and letters and prayers, all of which had relation to benefit others rather than himself. Who has ever done more to instruct the world, to enable men to rise not in fortune merely, but in virtue and patriotism, in those things which are of themselves the only reward? We should consider these labors, as well as the new method he taught to arrive at knowledge, in our estimate of the sage as well as of the man. He was a moral philosopher like Socrates. He even soared into the realm of supposititious truth like Plato. He observed nature like Aristotle. He took away the syllogism from Thomas Aquinas, not to throw contempt on metaphysical inquiry or dialectical reasoning, but to arrive by a better method at the knowledge of the first principles, which once established, he allowed deductions to be drawn from them, leading to other truths as certainly as induction itself. Yea, he was also a Moses on the Mount of Pisgah, from which with prophetic eye he could survey the promised land of indefinite wealth and boundless material prosperity, which he was not permitted to enter, but which he bequeathed to civilization. This may have been his greatest gift in the view of scientific men, this inductive process of reasoning, by which great discoveries have been made after he was dead. But this was not his only legacy, for other things which he taught were as valuable, not merely in his sight, but to the eye of enlightened reason. There are other truths besides those of physical science. There is greatness in deduction as well as in induction. Geometry, whose successive and progressive revelations are so inspiring, and which have come down to us from a remote antiquity, which are even now taught in our modern schools as Euclid demonstrated them, since they cannot be improved, is a purely deductive science. The scholastic philosophy, even if it was barren and unfruitful in leading to new truths, yet confirmed what was valuable in the old systems, and by the severity of its logic and its dialectical subtleties trained the European mind for the reception of the messages of Luther and Bacon. And this was based on deductions, never wrong unless the premises are unsound. Theology is deductive reasoning from truths assumed to be fundamental, and is inductive only so far as it collates Scripture declarations and interprets their meaning by the aid which learning brings. Is not this science worthy of some regard? Will it not live when all the speculations of evolutionists are forgotten, and occupy the thoughts of the greatest and profoundest minds, so long as anything shall be studied, so long as the Bible shall be the guide of life? Is it not by deduction that we ascend from nature herself to the God of nature? What is more certain than deduction when the principles from which it reasons are indisputably established? Is induction, great as it is, especially in the explorations of nature and science, always certain? Are not most of the sciences which are based upon it progressive? Have we yet learned the ultimate principles of political economy, or of geology, or of government, or even of art? The theory of induction, though supposed by Dr. Whewell to lead to certain results, is regarded by Professor Jevons as leading to results only almost certain. All inductive inference is merely probable, says the present Professor of Logic, Thomas Fowler, in the University of Oxford. And although it is supposed that the inductive method of Bacon has led to the noblest discoveries of modern times, is this strictly true? Galileo made his discoveries in the heavens before Bacon died. Physical improvements must need follow such inventions as gunpowder and the mariner's compass, and printing and the pictures of Italy, and the discovery of mines and the revived arts of the Romans and Greeks, and the glorious emancipation which the Reformation produced. Why should not the modern races follow in the track of Carthage and Alexandria and Rome with the progress of wealth, and carry out inventions as those cities did, and all other civilized peoples since Babel towered above the plains of Babylon? Physical developments arise from the developments of man, whatever method may be recommended by philosophers. What philosophical teachings led to the machinery of the mines of California, or to that of the mills of Lowell? Some think that our modern improvements would have come whether Bacon had lived or not. But I would not disparage the labors of Bacon in pointing out the method which leads to scientific discoveries. Granting that he sought merely utility, and improvement in the outward condition of society, which is the view that Macaulay takes, I would not underrate his legacy. And even supposing that the blessings of material life, the acre of Middlesex, are as much to be desired as Macaulay, with the complacency of an eminently practical and prosperous man, seems to argue, I would not sneer at them. Who does not value them? Who will not value them so long as our mortal bodies are to be cared for? It is a pleasant thing to ride in cars without horses, to feel winter in the genial warmth of grates and furnaces, to receive messages from distant friends in a moment of time, to cross the ocean without discomfort, with the almost certainty of safety, and save our wives and daughters from the ancient drudgeries of the loom and the knitting needle. Who ever tires in gazing at a locomotive as it whirls along with the power of destiny? Who is not astonished at the triumphs of the engineer, the wonders of an ocean steamer, the marvelous tunnels under lofty mountains? We feel that Titans have been sent to ease us of our burdens. But great and beneficent as are these blessings, they are not the only certitudes, nor are they the greatest. An outward life of ease and comfort is not the chief end of man. The interests of the soul are more important than any comforts of the body. The higher life is only reached by lofty contemplation on the true, the beautiful, and the good. Subjective wisdom is worth more than objective knowledge. What are the great realities? Machinery, new breeds of horses, carpets, diamonds, mirrors, gas? Or are they affections, friendships, generous impulses, inspiring thoughts? Look to Socrates. What raised that barefooted, ugly-looking, impecunious, persecuted, cross-questioning, self-constituted teacher, without pay, to the loftiest pedestal of Athenian fame? What was the spirit of the truths he taught? Was it objective or subjective truth, the way to become rich and comfortable, or the search for the indefinite, the infinite, the eternal? Utopia, not Middlesex, that which fed the wants of the immaterial soul and enabled it to rise above temptation and vulgar rewards. What raised Plato to the highest pinnacle of intellectual life? Was it definite and practical knowledge of outward phenomena? Or was it a longing after love, in the contemplation of which the mortal soul sustains itself, and becomes participant in the glories of immortality? What were realities to Anselm, Bernard, and Bonaventura? What gave beauty and placidity to Descartes and Leibniz and Kant? It may be very dignified for a modern savant to sit serenely on his tower of observation, indifferent to all the lofty speculations of the great men of bygone ages, yet those questions pertaining to the Greek logos and the Greek taonta, which had such attractions for Augustine and Pascal and Calvin, did have as real bearing on human life and on what is best worth knowing, as the scales of the Luciscus Cephalus, or the limbs of a magnified Amalculus, or any of the facts of which physical science can boast. The wonders of science are great, but also are the secrets of the soul, the mysteries of the spiritual life, the truths which come from divine revelation. Whatever most dignifies humanity and makes our labors sweet, and causes us to forget our pains, and kindles us to lofty contemplations, and prompts us to heroic sacrifice, is the most real and the most useful. Even the leaves of a barren and neglected philosophy may be in some important respects of more value than all the boasted fruit of utilitarian science. Is that which is most useful always the most valuable? That, I mean, which gives the highest pleasure? Do we not plant our grounds with the acacia, the oak, the cedar, the elm, as well as the apple, the pear, and the cherry? Are not flowers and shrubs which beautify the lawn as desirable as beans and turnips and cabbages? Is not the rose or tulip as great an addition to even a poor man's cottage as his bed of onions or patch of potatoes? What is the scale to measure even mortal happiness? What is the marketable value of friendship or of love? What makes the dinner of herbs sometimes more refreshing than the stalled ox? What is the material profit of a first love? What is the value in tangible dollars and cents of a beautiful landscape, or a speaking picture, or a marble statue, or a living book, or the voice of eloquence, or the charm of earliest bird, or the smile of a friend, or the promise of immortality? In what consisted the real glory of the country we are never weary of quoting, the land of Phidias and Pericles and Demosthenes? Was it not in immaterial ideas, in patriotism, in heroism, in conceptions of ideal beauty, in speculations on the infinite and unattainable, in the songs which still inspire the minds of youth, in the expression which made marble live, in those conceptions of beauty and harmony which still give shape to the temples of Christendom? Was Rome more glorious with her fine roads and tables of thuja root, and Falernian wines, and oysters from the Lucrine lake, and chariots of silver, and robes of purple, and rings of gold, these useful blessings which are the pride of an Epicurean civilization? And who gave the last support, who raised the last barrier against that inundation of destructive pleasures in which some see the most valued fruits of human invention, but which proved a canker that prepared the way to ruin? It was that pious emperor who learned his wisdom from a slave, and who set a haughty defiance to all the grandeur and all the comforts of the highest position which earth could give, and spent his leisure hours in the quiet study of those truths which elevate the soul, truths not taught by science or nature, but by communication with invisible powers. Ah, what indeed is reality? What is the higher good? What is that which perishes never? What is that which assimilates man to deity? Is it houses? Is it lands? Is it gold and silver? Is it luxurious couches? Is it the practical utilitarian comforts that pamper this mortal body in its brief existence? Or is it women's loves and patriots' struggles, and sages' pious thoughts, affections, noble aspirations, Bethanies, the serenities of virtuous old age, the harmonies of unpolluted homes, the existence of art, of truth, of love, the hopes which last when sun and stars decay? Tell us, ye women, what are realities to you? Your carpets, your plate, your jewels, your luxurious banquets? Or your husband's love, your friend's esteem, your children's reverence? And ye, toiling men of business, what is really your highest joy? Your piles of gold, your marble palaces, or the pleasures of your home, the approbation of your consciences, your hopes of future bliss? Yes, you are dreamers, like poets and philosophers, when you call yourself pack horses. Even you are only sustained in labor by intangible rewards that you can neither see nor feel. The most practical of men and women can really only live in those ideas which are deemed indefinite and unreal. For what do the busiest of you run away from money making, and ride in cold or heat, in dreariness or discomfort, dinners or greetings of love and sympathy? On what are such festivals as Christmas and Thanksgiving Day based? On consecrated sentiments that have more force than any material gains or ends. These, after all, are realities to you as much as ideas were to Plato, or music to Beethoven, or patriotism to Washington. Deny these as the higher certitudes, and you rob the soul of its dignity, and life of its consolations. Authorities. Bacon's Works, edited by Basil Montague. Bacon's Life, by Basil Montague. Bacon's Life, by James Spedding. Bacon's Life, by Thomas Fowler. Dr. Abbott's Introduction to Bacon's Essays, in Contemporary Review, 1876. Macaulay's famous essay in Edinburgh Review, 1839. Archbishop Whately's Annotations of the Essays of Bacon. The General Histories of England. End of section 23. Section 24 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 6, Renaissance and Reformation, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Galileo, Part 1. A.D. 1564 to 1642. Astronomical discoveries. Among the wonders of the 16th century was the appearance of a new star in the northern horizon, which, shining at first with a feeble light, gradually surpassed the brightness of the planet Jupiter, and then, changing its color from white to yellow, and from yellow to red, after 17 months, faded away from sight, and has not since reappeared. This celebrated star, first seen by Tycho Brahe in the constellation Cassiopeia, never changed its position, or presented the slightest perceptible parallax. It could not therefore have been a meteor, nor a planet regularly revolving around the sun, nor a comet blazing with fiery nebulous light, nor a satellite of one of the planets, but a fixed star far beyond our solar system. Such a phenomenon created an immense sensation, and has never since been satisfactorily explained by philosophers. In the infancy of astronomical science, it was regarded by astrologers as a sign to portend the birth of an extraordinary individual. Though the birth of some great political character was supposed to be heralded by this mysterious star, its prophetic meaning might with more propriety apply to the extraordinary man who astonished his contemporaries by discoveries in the heavens, and who forms the subject of this lecture, or it poetically might apply to the brilliancy of the century itself in which it appeared. The 16th century cannot be compared with the 19th century in variety and scope of scientific discoveries, but, compared with the ages which had preceded it, it was a memorable epoch, marked by the simultaneous breaking up of the darkness of medieval Europe and the bursting forth of new energies in all departments of human thought and action. In that century arose great artists, poets, philosophers, theologians, reformers, navigators, jurists, statesmen, whose genius has scarcely since been surpassed. In Italy it was marked by the triumphs of scholars and artists; in Germany and France by reformers and warriors; in England by that splendid constellation that shed glory on the reign of Elizabeth. Close upon the artists who followed Da Vinci to Salvator Rosa were those scholars of whom Emmanuel Chrysoloras, Erasmus, and Scaliger were the representatives, going back to the classical fountains of Greece and Rome, reviving a study for antiquity, breathing a new spirit into universities, enriching vernacular tongues, collecting and collating manuscripts, translating the Scriptures, and stimulating the learned to emancipate themselves from the trammels of the scholastic philosophers. Then rose up the reformers, headed by Luther, consigning to destruction the emblems and ceremonies of mediaeval superstition, defying popes, burning bulls, ridiculing monks, exposing frauds, unraveling sophistries, attacking vices and traditions with the new arms of reason, and asserting before councils and dignitaries the right of private judgment and the supreme authority of the Bible in all matters of religious faith. And then appeared the defenders of their cause, by force of arms, maintaining the great rights of religious liberty in France, Germany, Switzerland, Holland, and England, until Protestantism was established in half of the countries that had for more than 1,000 years servilely bowed down to the authority of the popes. Genius stimulates and enterprise multiplies all the energies and aims of emancipated millions. Before the close of the 16th century, new continents are colonized, new modes of warfare are introduced, manuscripts are changed into printed books, the comforts of life are increased, governments are more firmly established, and learned men are enriched and honored. Feudalism has succumbed to central power, and barons revolve around their sovereign at court rather than compose an independent authority. Before that century had been numbered with the ages past, the Portuguese had sailed to the East Indies, Sir Francis Drake had circumnavigated the globe, Pizarro had conquered Peru, Sir Walter Raleigh had colonized Virginia, Ricci had penetrated to China, Lascaux had planned the Palace of the Louvre, Raphael had painted the Transfiguration, Michelangelo had raised the Dome of St. Peter's, Giacomo della Porta had ornamented the Vatican with mosaics, Copernicus had taught the true center of planetary motion, Dumoulin had introduced into French jurisprudence the principles of the Justinian Code. Ariosto had published the Orlando Furioso. Cervantes had written Don Quixote. Spenser had dedicated his Faerie Queen. Shakespeare had composed his immortal dramas. Hooker had devised his Ecclesiastical Polity. Cranmer had published his 42 Articles. John Calvin had dedicated to Francis I his celebrated Institutes. Luther had translated the Bible, Bacon had begun the insaturation of philosophy, Bellarmine had systematized the Roman Catholic theology, Henry IV. Had signed the Edict of Nantes, Queen Elizabeth had defeated the Invisible Armada, and William the Silent had achieved the independence of Holland. Such were some of the lights and some of the enterprises of that great age, when the profoundest questions pertaining to philosophy, religion, law, and government were discussed with the enthusiasm and freshness of a revolutionary age; when men felt the inspiration of a new life, and looked back on the Middle Ages with disgust and hatred, as a period which enslaved the human soul. But what peculiarly marked that period was the commencement of those marvellous discoveries in science which have enriched our times, and added to the material blessings of the new civilization. Tycho Brahe, Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, and Bacon inaugurated the era which led to progressive improvements in the physical condition of society, and to those scientific marvels which have followed in such quick succession and produced such astonishing changes, that we are fain to boast that we have entered upon the most fortunate and triumphant epoch in our world's history. Many men might be taken as the representatives of this new era of science and material inventions, but I select Galileo Galilei as one of the most interesting in his life, opinions, and conflicts. Galileo was born at Pisa in the year 1564, the year that Calvin and Michelangelo died, 4 years after the birth of Bacon, in the 6th year of the reign of Elizabeth and the 4th of Charles IX., about the time when the Huguenot persecution was at its height, and the Spanish monarchy was in its most prosperous state, under Philip II. His parents were of noble but impoverished Florentine family, and his father, who was a man of some learning, a writer on the science of music, gave him the best education he could afford. Like so many of the most illustrious men, he gave early promise of rare abilities. It was while he was a student in the university of his native city that his attention was arrested by the vibrations of a lamp suspended from the ceiling of the cathedral, and before he had quitted the church, while the choir was chanting medieval anthems, he had compared those vibrations with his own pulse, which, after repeated experiments, ended in the construction of the first pendulum, applied not as it was by Huygens to the measurement of time, but to medical science, to enable physicians to ascertain the rate of the pulse. But the pendulum was soon brought into the service of the clockmakers, and ultimately to the determination of the form of the earth, by its minute irregularities in diverse latitudes, and finally to the measurement of differences of longitude by its connection with electricity and the recording of astronomical observations. Thus it was that the swinging of a cathedral lamp, before the eye of a man of genius, has done nearly as much as the telescope itself to advance science, to say nothing of its practical uses in common life. Galileo had been destined by his father to enter the profession of medicine, and was ignorant of mathematics. He amused his leisure hours with painting and music, and in order to study the principles of drawing, he found it necessary to acquire some knowledge of geometry, much to the annoyance of his father, who did not like to see his mind diverted from the prescriptions of Hippocrates and Galen. The certain truths of geometry burst upon him like a revelation, and after mastering Euclid he turned to Archimedes with equal enthusiasm. Mathematics now absorbed his mind, and the father was obliged to yield to the bent of his genius, which seemed to disdain the regular professions by which social position was most surely effected. He wrote about this time an essay on the hydrostatic balance, which introduced him to Guido Ubaldo, a famous mathematician, who induced him to investigate the subject of the center of gravity in solid bodies. His treatise on this subject secured an introduction to the Grand Duke of Tuscany, who perceived his merits, and by whom he was appointed a lecturer on mathematics at Pisa, but on the small salary of 60 crowns a year. This was in 1589, when he was 25, an enthusiastic young man, full of hope and animal spirits, the charm of every circle for his intelligence, vivacity, and wit, but bold and sarcastic, contemptuous of ancient dogmas, defiant of authority, and therefore no favorite with Jesuit priests and Dominican professors. It is said that he was a handsome man, with bright golden locks, such as painters in that age loved to perpetuate upon the canvas. Hilarious and cheerful, fond of good cheer, yet a close student, obnoxious only to learned dunces and narrow pedants and treadmill professors and bigoted priests, all of whom sought to molest him, yet to whom he was either indifferent or sarcastic, holding them in their formulas up to ridicule. He now directed his inquiries to the mechanical doctrines of Aristotle, to whose authority the schools had long bowed down, and whom he too regarded as one of the great intellectual giants of the world, yet not to be credited without sufficient reasons. Before the Novum Organum was written, He sought, as Bacon himself pointed out, the way to arrive at truth, a foundation to stand upon, a principle tested by experience, which, when established by experiment, would serve for sure deductions. Now, one of the principles assumed by Aristotle, and which had never been disputed, was, that if different weights of the same material were let fall from the same height, the heavier would reach the ground sooner than the lighter, and in proportion to the difference of weight. This assumption Galileo denied, and asserted that, with the exception of a small difference owing to the resistance of the air, both would fall to the ground in the same space of time. To prove his position by actual experiment, he repaired to the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and demonstrated that he was right and Aristotle was wrong. The Aristotelians would not believe the evidence of their own senses, and ascribed the effect to some unknown cause. To such a degree were men enslaved by authority. This provoked Galileo, and led him to attack authority with still greater vehemence, adding mockery to sarcasm, which again exasperated his opponents, and doubtless laid the foundation of that personal hostility which afterwards pursued him to the prison of the Inquisition. This blended arrogance and asperity in a young man was offensive to the whole university, yet natural to one who had overturned one of the favorite axioms of the greatest master of thought the world had seen for nearly 2,000 years. And the scorn and opposition with which his discovery was received increased his rancor, so that he, in his turn, did not render justice to the learned men arrayed against him, who were not necessarily dull or obstinate because they would not at once give up the opinion in which they were educated, and which the learned world still accepted. Nor did they oppose and hate him for his new opinions, so much as from dislike of his personal arrogance and bitter sarcasms. At last his enemies made it too hot for him at Pisa. He resigned his chair, 1591, but only to accept a higher position at Padua, on a salary of 180 florins, not, however, adequate to his support, so that he was obliged to take pupils in mathematics. To show the comparative estimate of that age of science, the fact may be mentioned that the professor of scholastic philosophy in the same university was paid 1,400 florins. This was in 1592. And the next year Galileo invented the thermometer, still an imperfect instrument, since air was not perfectly excluded. At this period his reputation seems to have been established as a brilliant lecturer rather than as a great discoverer, or even as a great mathematician, for he was immeasurably behind Kepler, his contemporary, in the power of making abstruse calculations and numerical combinations. In this respect Kepler was inferior only to Copernicus, Newton, and Laplace in our times, or Hipparchus and Ptolemy among the ancients. And it is to him that we owe the discovery of those great laws of planetary motion from which there is no appeal, and which may have never been rivaled in importance except those made by Newton himself. Laws which connect the mean distance of the planet from the sun with the times of their revolutions. Laws which show that the orbits of planets are elliptical, not circular, and that the areas described by lines drawn from the moving planet to the sun are proportional to the times employed in the motion. What an infinity of calculation, in the infancy of science, before the invention of logarithms, was necessary to arrive at these truths! What fertility of invention was displayed in all his hypotheses! What patience in working them out! What magnanimity in discarding those which were not true! What power of guessing, even to hit upon theories which could be established by elaborate calculations! All from the primary thought, the grand axiom which Kepler was the first to propose, that there must be some numerical or geometrical relations among the times, distances, and velocities of the revolving bodies of the solar system. It would seem that although his science was deductive, he invoked the aid of induction also. A great original genius, yet modest like Newton, a man who avoided hostilities, yet given to the most boundless enthusiasm on the subjects to which he devoted his life. How intense his raptures! "Nothing holds me," he writes, on discovering his great laws. "I will indulge in my sacred fury. I will boast of the golden vessels I have stolen from the Egyptians. If you forgive me, I rejoice. If you are angry, it is all the same to me. The die is cast, the book is written, to be read either now or by posterity, I care not which. It may well wait a century for a reader, as God has waited 6,000 years for an observer." We do not see this sublime repose in the attitude of Galileo, this falling back on his own conscious greatness, willing to let things take their natural course; but rather, on the other hand, an impatience under contradiction, a vehement scorn of adversaries, and an intellectual arrogance that gave offence, and impeded his career, and injured his fame. No matter how great a man may be, his intellectual pride is always offensive, and when united with sarcasm and mockery, it will make bitter enemies, who will pull him down. Galileo, on his transfer to Padua, began to teach the doctrines of Copernicus, a much greater genius than he, and yet one who provoked no enmities, although he made the greatest revolution in astronomical knowledge that any man ever made, since he was in no haste to reveal his discoveries, and stated them in a calm and inoffensive way. I doubt if new discoverers in science meet with serious opposition when men themselves are not attacked, and they are made to appeal to calm intelligence, and war is not made on those scripture texts which seem to controvert them. Even theologians receive science when science is not made to undermine theological declarations, and when the divorce of science from revelation, reason from faith, as two distinct realms, is vigorously insisted upon. Pascal incurred no hostilities for his scientific investigations, nor Newton, nor Laplace. It is only when scientific men sneer at the Bible, because its declarations cannot always be harmonized with science, that the hostilities of theologians are provoked. And it is only when theologians deny scientific discoveries that seem to conflict with the texts of Scripture that opposition arises among scientific men. It would seem that the doctrine of Copernicus were offensive to churchmen on this narrow ground. It was hard to believe that the earth revolved around the sun, when the opinions of the learned for 2,000 years were unanimous that the sun revolved around the earth. Had both theologian and scientist let the Bible alone, there would not have been a bitter war between them. But scientists were accused by theologians of undermining the Bible, and theologians were accused of stupid obstinacy, and were mercilessly exposed to ridicule. That was the great error of Galileo. He made fun and sport of the theologians, as Samson did of the Philistines, and the Philistines of Galileo's day cut off his locks and put out his eyes when the Pope put him into their power, those Dominican inquisitors who made a crusade against human thought. If Galileo had shown more tact and less arrogance, possibly those Dominican doctors might have joined the chorus of universal praise, for they were learned men, although devoted to a bad system, and incapable of seeing truth when their old authorities were ridiculed and set at naught. Galileo did not deny the Scriptures, but his spirit was mocking, and he seemed to prejudiced people to undermine the truths which were felt to be vital for the preservation of faith in the world. And as some scientific truths seem to be adverse to Scripture declarations, the transition was easy to a denial of the inspiration which was claimed by nearly all Christian sects, both Catholic and Protestant. The intolerance of the Church in every age has driven many scientists into infidelity, for it cannot be doubted that the tendency of scientific investigation has been to make scientific men incredulous of divine inspiration, and hence to undermine their faith in dogmas which good men have ever received, and which are supported by evidence that is not merely probable, but almost certain. And all now that seems wanting to harmonize science with revelation is, on the one hand, the re-examination of the Scripture texts on which are based the principia from which deductions are made, and which we call theology, and on the other hand, the rejection of indefensible statements which are at war with both science and consciousness, except in those matters which claim special supernatural agency, which we can neither prove nor disprove by reason. For supernaturalism claims to transcend the realm of reason altogether in what relates to the government of God, ways that no searching will ever enable us to find out with our limited faculties and obscured understanding. When the two realms of reason and faith are kept distinct, and neither encroaches on the other, then the discoveries and claims of science will meet with but little opposition from theologians, and they will be left to be sifted by men who alone are capable of the task. Thus far, science, outside of pure mathematics, is made up of theories which are greatly modified by advancing knowledge, so that they cannot claim in all respects to be eternally established, like the laws of Kepler and the discoveries of Copernicus, the latter of which were only true in the main fact that the earth revolves around the sun. But even he retained epicycles and eccentrics, and could not explain the unequal orbits of planetary motion. In fact, he retained many of the errors of Hipparchus and Ptolemy. Much, too, as we are inclined to ridicule the astronomy of the ancients because they made the earth the center, we should remember that they also resolved the orbits of the heavenly bodies into circular motions, discovered the precession of the equinoxes, and knew also the apparent motions of the planets and their periods. They could predict eclipses of the sun and moon, and knew that the orbit of the sun and planets was through a belt in the heavens, of a few degrees in width, which they called the zodiac. They did not know, indeed, the difference between real and apparent motion, nor the distance of the sun and stars, nor their relative size and weight, nor the laws of motion, nor the principles of gravitation, nor the nature of the Milky Way, nor the existence of nebulae, nor any of the wonders which the telescope reveals. But in the severity of their mathematical calculations they were quite equal to modern astronomers. If Copernicus revolutionized astronomy by proving the sun to be the center of motion to our planetary system, Galileo gave it an immense impulse by his discoveries with the telescope. These did not require such marvelous mathematical powers as made Kepler and Newton immortal, the equals of Ptolemy and Hipparchus in mathematical demonstration, but only accuracy and perseverance in observations. Doubtless he was a great mathematician, but his fame rests on his observations and the deductions he made from them. These were more easily comprehended and had an objective value which made him popular, and for these discoveries he was indebted in a great measure to the labors of others. It was mechanical invention applied to the advancement of science. The utilization of science was reserved to our times, and it is this utilization which makes science such a handmaid to the enrichment of its votaries, and holds it up to worship in our laboratories and schools of technology and minds, not merely for itself, but also for the substantial fruit it yields. It was when Galileo was writing treatises on the structure of the universe, on local motion, on sound, on continuous quantity, on light, on colors, on the tides, on dialing, subjects that also interested Lord Bacon at the same time period. And when he was giving lectures on these subjects with immense éclat, frequently to 1,000 persons, scarcely less than what Abelard enjoyed when he made fun of the more conservative schoolmen with whom he was brought in contact, that he heard, while on a visit to Venice, that a Dutch spectacle maker had invented an instrument which was said to represent distant objects nearer than they usually appeared. This was in 1609, when he, at the age of 55, was the idol of scientific men, and was in the enjoyment of an ample revenue, giving only 60 half-hours in the year to lectures, and allowed time to prosecute his studies in that sweet solitariness which all true scholars prize, and without which few great attainments are made. The rumor of the invention excited in his mind the intensest interest. He sought for the explanation of the fact in the doctrine of refraction. He meditated day and night. At last he himself constructed an instrument, a leaden organ pipe with 2 spectacle glasses, both plain on one side, while on one of them had its opposite side convex and the other its second side concave. This crude little instrument, which magnified but 3 times, he carries in triumph back to Venice. It is regarded as a scientific toy, yet everybody wishes to see an instrument by which the human eye indefinitely multiplies its power. The Doge is delighted, and the Senate is anxious to secure so great a curiosity. He makes a present of it to the Senate, after he has spent a month in showing it round to the principal people of that wealthy city. And he is rewarded for his ingenuity with an increase of his salary, at Padua, to 1,000 florins, and is made professor for life. He now only thinks of making discoveries in the heavens, but his instrument is too small. He makes another and larger telescope, which magnifies 8 times, and then another which magnifies 30 times, and points it to the moon. And how indescribable his satisfaction, for he sees what no mortal had ever before seen: ranges of mountains, deep hollows, and various inequalities. These discoveries, it would seem, are not favorably received by the Aristotelians. However, he continues his labors, and points his telescope to the planets and fixed stars. But the magnitude of the latter remain the same, while the planets appear with disks like the moon. Then he directs his observation to the Pleiades, and counts 40 stars in the cluster, when only 6 were visible to the naked eye. In the Milky Way he descries crowds of minute stars. Having now reached the limit of discovery with his present instrument, he makes another of still greater power, and points it at the planet Jupiter. On the 7th of January, 1610, he observes 3 little stars near the body of the planet, all in a straight line, and parallel to the ecliptic, 2 on the east and 1 on the west of Jupiter. On the next observation he finds that they have changed places, and all are on the west of Jupiter, and the next time he observes them they have changed again. He also discovers that there are 4 of these little stars revolving around the planet. What is the explanation of this singular phenomenon? They cannot be fixed stars or planets, they must be moons. Jupiter is attended with satellites like the Earth, but has 4 instead of 1. The importance of this last discovery was of supreme value, for it confirmed the heliocentric theory. Old Kepler is filled with agitations of joy. All the friends of Galileo extol his genius. His fame spreads far and near. He is regarded as the ablest scientific man in Europe. End of section 24. Section 25 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 6, Renaissance and Reformation, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Galileo, Part 2. His enemies are now dismayed and perplexed. The principal professor of philosophy at Padua would not even look through the wonderful instrument. Cece of Florence ridicules the discovery. As, said he, there are only 7 apertures of the head, 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 nostrils, and 1 mouth, and as there are only 7 days in the week and 7 metals, how can there be 7 planets? But science, discarded by the schools, fortunately finds a refuge among princes. Cosimo de' Medici prefers the testimony of his senses to the voice of authority. He observes the new satellites with Galileo at Pisa, makes him a present of 1,000 florins, and gives him a mere nominal office, that of lecturing occasionally to princes, on a salary of 1,000 florins for life. He is now the chosen companion of the great and the admiration of Italy. He has rendered an immense service to astronomy. His discovery of the satellites of Jupiter, says Herschel, gave the holding turn to the opinion of mankind respecting the Copernican system, and pointed out a connection between speculative astronomy and practical utility. But this did not complete the catalogue of his discoveries. In 1610 he perceived that Saturn appeared to be triple, and excited the curiosity of astronomers by the publication of his first enigma, Altissimam planetam tergeminam observavi. He could not then perceive the rings. The planet seemed through his telescope to have the form of 3 concentric zeros. Soon after, in examining Venus, he saw her in the form of a crescent. Cynthio figuras omeletur mater amorum. Venus rivals the phases of the moon. At last he discovers the spots upon the sun's disk, and that they all revolve with the sun, and therefore the sun has a revolution in about 28 days, and may be moving on in a larger circle, with all its attendant planets, around some distant centre. Galileo has now attained the highest object of his ambition. He is at the head, confessedly, of all the scientific men of Europe. He has an ample revenue, he is independent, and has perfect leisure. Even the Pope is gracious to him when he makes a visit to Rome, while cardinals, princes, and ambassadors rival one another in bestowing upon him attention and honors. But there is no height of fortune from which a man may not fall, and it is usually the proud, the ostentatious, and the contemptuous who do fall, since they create envy and are apt to make social mistakes. Galileo continued to exasperate his enemies by his arrogance and sarcasms. They refused to be dragged at his chariot wheels. The Aristotelian professors, says Brewster, the temporizing Jesuits, the political churchmen, and that timid but respectable body who at all times dread innovation, whether it be in a legislation or science, entered into an alliance against the philosophical tyrant who threatened them with the penalties of knowledge. The church dignitaries were especially hostile, since they thought the tendency of Galileo's investigations was to undermine the Bible. Flanked by the logic of the schools and the popular interpretation of Scripture, and backed by the civil power, they were eager for war. Galileo wrote a letter to his friend, the Abbé Castelli, the object of which was to prove that the Scriptures were not intended to teach science and philosophy, but to point out the way of salvation. He was indiscreet enough to write a longer letter of 70 pages, quoting the Fathers in support of his views, and attempting to show that nature and Scripture could not speak a different language. It was this reasoning which irritated the dignities of the Church more than his discoveries, since it is plain that the literal language of Scripture upholds the doctrine that the sun revolves around the earth. He was wrong or foolish in trying to harmonize revelation and science. He should have advanced his truths of science and left them to take care of themselves. He should not have meddled with the dogmas of his enemies. Not that he was wrong in doing so, but it was not politic or wise, and he was not called upon to harmonize Scripture with science. So his enemies busily employed themselves in collecting evidence against him. They laid their complaints before the Inquisition of Rome, and on the occasion of paying a visit to that city, he was summoned before that tribunal which has been the shame and the reproach of the Catholic Church. It was a tribunal utterly incompetent to sit upon his case, since it was ignorant of science. In 1615 it was decreed that Galileo should renounce his obnoxious doctrines, and pledge himself neither to defend nor publish them in the future. And Galileo accordingly, in dread of prison, appeared before Cardinal Bellarmine and declared that he would renounce the doctrines he had defended. This cardinal was not an ignorant man. He was the greatest theologian of the Catholic Church, but his bitterness and rancor in reference to the new doctrines were as marked as his scholastic learning. The Pope, supposing Galileo would adhere to his promise, was gracious and kind. But the philosopher could not resist the temptation of ridiculing the advocates of the old system. He called them paper philosophers. In private he made a mockery of his persecutors. One Sayce undertook to prove from Suidas that the Babylonians used to cook eggs by whirling them swiftly on a sling, to which he replied, "If Sayce insists on the authority of Suidas that the Babylonians cooked eggs by whirling them on a sling, I will believe it. But I must add that we have eggs and slings and strong men to whirl them, yet they will not become cooked. Nay, if they were hot at first, they will more quickly become cool. And as there is nothing wanting to us but to be Babylonians, it follows that being Babylonians is the true cause why the eggs became hard." Such was his prevailing mockery and ridicule. "Your Eminence," writes one of his friends to the Cardinal d'Este, "would be delighted if you could hear him hold forth in the midst of 15 or 20, all violently attacking him, sometimes in one house, and sometimes in another; but he is armed after such a fashion that he laughs them all to scorn." Galileo, after his admonition from the Inquisition, and his promise to hold his tongue, did keep comparatively quiet for a while, amusing himself with mechanics, and striving to find out a new way of discovering longitude at sea. But the want of better telescopes baffled his efforts, and even to day it is said that no telescope has yet been made which is capable of observing at sea the eclipses of Jupiter's satellites, by which on shore this method of finding longitude has many advantages. On the accession of a new pope, 1623, Urban VIII., who had been his friend as Cardinal Barberini, Galileo, after 8 years of silence, thought that he might now venture to publish his great work on the Ptolemaic and Copernican systems, especially as a papal censor had also been his friend. But the publication of the book was delayed nearly 2 years, so great were the obstacles to be surmounted, and so prejudiced and hostile was the Church to the new views. At last it appeared in Florence in 1632, with a dedication to the Grand Duke, not the Cosimo who had rewarded him, but his son Ferdinand, who was a mere youth. It was an unfortunate thing for Galileo to do. He had pledged his word not to advocate the Copernican theory, which was already sufficiently established in the opinions of philosophers. The form of the book was even offensive, in the shape of dialogues, where some of the chief speakers were his enemies. One of them he ridiculed under the name of Simplicio. This was supposed to mean the Pope himself, so they made the Pope believe, and he was furious. Old Cardinal Bellarmine roared like a lion. The whole Church, as represented by its dignitaries, seemed to be against him. The Pope seized the old weapons of the Clements and the Gregories to hurl upon the daring innovator, but delayed to hurl them, since he dealt with a giant, covered not only by the shield of the Medici, but that of Minerva. So he convened a congregation of cardinals, and submitted to them the examination of the detested book. The author was summoned to Rome to appear before the Inquisition, and answer at its judgment seat the charges against him as a heretic. The Tuscan ambassador expostulated with his holiness against such a cruel thing, considering Galileo's age, infirmities, and fame. All to no avail. He was obliged to obey the summons. At the age of 70, this venerated philosopher, infirm, in precarious health, appeared before the Inquisition of cardinals, not one of whom had any familiarity with abstruse speculations, or even with mathematics. Whether out of regard to his age and infirmities, or to his great fame and illustrious position as the greatest philosopher of his day, the cardinals treat Galileo with unusual indulgence. Though a prisoner of the Inquisition, and completely in its hands, with the power of life and death, it would seem that he is allowed every personal comfort. His table is provided by the Tuscan ambassador. A servant obeys his slightest nod. He sleeps in the luxurious apartment of the fiscal of that dreaded body. He is even liberated on the responsibility of a cardinal. He is permitted to lodge in the palace of the ambassador. He is allowed time to make his defense. Those holy inquisitors would not unnecessarily harm a hair of his head. Nor was it probably their object to inflict bodily torments. These would call out sympathy, and degrade the tribunal. It was enough to threaten these torments, to which they did not wish to resort except in case of necessity. There is no evidence that Galileo was personally tortured. He was indeed a martyr, but not a sufferer except in humiliated pride. Probably the object of his enemies was to silence him, to degrade him, to expose his name to infamy, to arrest the spread of his doctrines, to bow his old head in shame, to murder his soul, to make him stab himself and be his own executioner, by an act which all posterity should regard as unworthy of his name and cause. After a fitting time has elapsed, 4 months of dignified session, the mind of the Holy Tribunal is made up. Its judgment is ready. On the 22nd of June, 1633, the prisoner appears in penitential dress at the convent of Minerva, and the presiding cardinal, in his scarlet robes, delivers the sentence of the court: that Galileo, as a warning to others, and by way of salutary penance, be condemned to the formal prison of the Holy Office, and be ordered to recite once a week the 7 penitential psalms for the benefit of his soul. Apparently a light sentence, only to be nominally imprisoned a few days and to repeat those psalms which were the life of blessed saints in medieval times. But this was nothing. He was required to recant, to abjure the doctrines he had taught, not in private, but publicly before the world. Will he recant? Will he subscribe himself an impostor? Will he abjure the doctrines on which his fame rests? Oh, tell it not in Gath! The timid, infirm, life-loving old patriarch of science falls. He is not great enough for martyrdom. He chooses shame. In an evil hour this venerable sage falls down upon his knees before the assembled cardinals, and reads aloud this recantation: I, Galileo Galilei, aged 70, on my knees before you, most reverend lords, and having my eye on the holy gospel, which I do touch with my lips, thus publish and declare, that I believe, and always have believed, and always will believe, every article which the Holy Catholic Roman Church holds and teaches. And as I have written a book in which I have maintained that the Son is the centre, which doctrine is repugnant to the Holy Scriptures, I, with sincere heart and unfeigned faith, do abjure and detest, and curse the said error and heresy, and all other errors contrary to said Holy Church, whose penance I solemnly swear to observe faithfully, and all other penances which have been or shall be laid upon me. It would appear from this confession that he did not declare his doctrines false, only that they were in opposition to the Scriptures. And it is also said that as he arose from his knees he whispered to a friend, "It does move, nevertheless." As some excuse for him, he acted with the certainty that he would be tortured if he did not recant, and at the worst he had only affirmed that his scientific theory was in opposition to the Scriptures. He had not denied his master, like Peter; he had not recanted the faith, like Cranmer. He had simply yielded for fear of bodily torments, and therefore was not sincere in the abjuration in which he made to save his life. Nevertheless, his recantation was a fall, and in the eyes of the scientific world perhaps greater than that of Bacon. Galileo was false to philosophy and himself. Why did he suffer himself to be conquered by priests he despised? Why did so bold and witty and proud a man betray his cause? Why did he not accept the penalty of intellectual freedom, and die, if die he must? What was life to him, diseased, infirm, and old? What had he more to gain? Was it not a good time to die and consummate his protests? Only 150 years before, one of his countrymen had accepted torture and death rather than recant his religious opinions. Why could not Galileo have been as great in martyrdom as Savonarola? He was a renowned philosopher, and brilliant as a man of genius, but he was a man of the world. He loved ease and length of days. He could ridicule and deride opponents. He could not suffer pain. He had a great intellect, but not a great soul. There were flaws in his morality. He was anything but a saint or hero. He was great in mind, and yet he was far from being great in character. We pity him while we exalt him. Nor is the world harsh to him; it forgives him for his services. The worst that can be said is that he was not willing to suffer and die for his opinions. And how many philosophers are there who are willing to be martyrs? Nevertheless, in the eyes of philosophers he has disgraced himself. Let him then return to Florence, to his own Arcady. He is a silenced man. But he is silenced, not because he believed with Copernicus, but because he ridiculed his enemies and confronted the Church, and in the eyes of blinded partisans had attacked divine authority. Why did Copernicus escape persecution? The Church must have known that there was something in his discoveries, and in those of Galileo, worthy of attention. About this time Pascal wrote, "It is vain that you have procured the condemnation of Galileo. That will never prove the earth to be at rest. If unerring observation proves that it turns round, not all mankind together can keep it from turning, nor themselves from turning with it. But let that persecution pass. It is no worse than other persecutions, either in Catholic or Protestant ranks. It was no worse than burning witches. Not only is intolerance in human nature, but there is a repugnance among the learned to receive new opinions when these interfere with their ascendency. The opposition to Galileo's discoveries was no greater than that of the Protestant Church, half a century ago, to some of the inductions of geology. How bitter the hatred, even in our times, to such men as Huxley and Darwin! True, they have not proved their theories as Galileo did, but they gave as great a shock as he to the minds of the theologians. All science is progressive, yet there are thousands who oppose its progress. And if learning and science should establish a different meaning to certain texts from which theological deductions are drawn, and these premises be undermined, there would be the same bitterness among the defenders of the present system of dogmatic theology. Yet theology will live, and never lose its dignity and importance. Only, some of its present assumptions may be discarded. God will never be dethroned from the world he governs, but some of his ways may appear to be different from what was once supposed. And all science is not only progressive, but it appears to be bold and scornful and proud. At least its advocates are and ever have been contemptuous of all other departments of knowledge but its own. So narrow and limited is the human mind in the midst of its own triumphs. So full of prejudices are even the learned and the great. Let us turn, then, to give another glance at the fallen philosopher in his final retreat at Arcady. He lives under restrictions, but they allow him leisure and choice wines, of which he is fond, and gardens and friends, and many come to do him reverence. He amuses his old age with the studies of his youth and manhood, and writes dialogues on motion, and even discovers the phenomena of the moon's libration. And by means of the pendulum he gives additional importance to astronomical science. But he is not allowed to leave his retirement, not even to visit his friends in Florence. The wrath of the Inquisition still pursues him, even in his villa at Arcady, in the suburbs of Florence. Then renewed afflictions come. He loses his daughter, who was devoted to him, and her death nearly plunges him into despair. The bulwarks of his heart break down, a flood of grief overwhelms his stricken soul, his appetite leaves him, his health forsakes him, his infirmities increase upon him. His right eye loses its power, the eye that had seen more of the heavens than the eyes of all who had gone before him. He becomes blind and deaf, and cannot sleep, afflicted with rheumatic pains and maladies forlorn. No more for him is rest or peace or bliss, still less the glories of his brighter days, the sight of glittering fields, the gems of heaven, without which neither breath of morn when she ascends, with charm of earliest birds, nor rising sun, on this delightful land, nor herb, fruit, flower, glistening with dew, nor fragrance after showers, nor grateful evening mild, is sweet. No more shall he gaze on features that he loves, or stars, or trees, or hills. No more to him returns day, or the sweet approach of even or morn, or sight of vernal bloom, or summer's rose, or flocks, or herds, or human face divine. But clouds instead, and ever during dark surround him. It was in those dreary, desolate days at Arcady. Unseen in manly beauty, Milton stood before him, gazing in reverent awe, Milton his guest, just then come forth, all life and enterprise, while he in his old age, exploring with his staff, his eyes upturned as to the golden sun, his eyeballs idly rolling. This may have been the punishment of his recantation, not inquisitorial torture, but the consciousness that he had lost his honor. Poor Galileo! Thine illustrious visitor, when his affliction came, could cast his sightless eyeballs inward and see and tell things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme, not rocks, caves, lakes, bogs, fens, and shades of death, where all life dies, death lives, and nature breeds gorgons and hydras and chimeras dire. But of eternal providence, and Eden with surpassing glory crowned, and our first parents, and of salvation, goodness infinite, of wisdom, which when known we need no higher, though all the stars we know by name, all the secrets of the deep, all nature's works, or works of God in heaven, or air, or sea. And yet, thou stricken observer of the heavenly bodies, hadst thou but known what marvels could be revealed by the power of thy wondrous instrument, after thou shouldst be laid lifeless and cold beneath the marble floor of Santa Croce, at the age of 78, without a monument, without even the right of burial in consecrated ground, having died a prisoner of the Inquisition, yet not without having rendered to astronomical sciences services of utmost value, even though thou might have died rejoicing as one of the great benefactors of the world. And thy discoveries shall be forever held in gratitude; they shall herald others of even greater importance. Newton shall prove that the different planets are attracted to the sun in the inverse ratio of the squares of their distances; that the earth has a force on the moon identical with the force of gravity; and that all celestial bodies, to the utmost boundaries of space, mutually attract each other; that all particles of matter are governed by the same law, the great law of gravitation, by which astronomy, in the language of Whewell, passed from boyhood to manhood, and by which law the great discoverer added more to the realm of science than any man before or since his day. And after Newton shall pass away, honored and lamented, and be buried with almost royal pomp in the vaults of Westminster, Halley and other mathematicians shall construct lunar tables, by which longitude shall be accurately measured on the pathless ocean. Lagrange and Laplace shall apply the Newtonian theory to determine the secular inequalities of celestial motion. They shall weigh absolutely the amount of matter in the planets; they shall show how far their orbits deviate from circles; and they shall enumerate the cycles of the changes detected in the circuit of the moon. Clairaut shall remove the perplexity occasioned by the seeming discrepancy between the observed and computed motions of the moon's perigee. Halley shall demonstrate the importance of observations of the transit of Venus as the only certain way of obtaining the sun's parallax, and hence the distance of the sun from the earth. He shall predict the return of that mysterious body which we call a comet. Herschel shall construct a telescope which magnifies 2,000 times, and add another planet to our system beyond the mighty orb of Saturn. Roemer shall estimate the velocity of light from the eclipses of Jupiter's satellite. Bessel shall pass the impassable gulf of space and measure the distance of some of the fixed stars, although such is the immeasurable space between the earth and those distant stars that the parallax of only about 30 has yet been discovered with our finest instruments. So boundless is the material universe, so vast are the distances, that light, traveling 160,000 miles with every pulsation of the blood, will not reach us from some of those remote worlds in 100,000 years. So marvelous shall be the victories of science, that the perturbations of the planets in their courses shall reveal the existence of a new one more distant than Uranus, and Leverrier shall tell at what part of the heavens that star shall first be seen. So far as we have discovered, the universe which we have observed with telescopic instruments has no limits that mortals can define. And in comparison with its magnitude, our earth is less than a grain of sand, and is so old that no genius can calculate and no imagination can conceive when it had a beginning. All that we know is, that suns exist at distances we cannot define. But around what center do they revolve? Of what are they composed? Are they inhabited by intelligent and immortal beings? Do we know that they are not eternal, except from the divine declaration that there was a time when the almighty fiat went forth for this grand creation? Creation involves a creator, and can the order and harmony seen in nature's laws exist without supreme intelligence and power? Who, then, and what is God? Canst thou by searching find him out? Knowest thou the ordinances of heaven? Canst thou bind the sweet influences of the Pleiades or the loose bands of Orion? What an atom is this world in the light of science! Yet what dignity has man by the light of revelation! What majesty and power and glory has God! What goodness, benevolence, and love, that even a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice! That we are the special objects of his providence and care! Is there an imagination so lofty that will not be oppressed with the discoveries that even the telescope has made? Ah, to what exalted heights reason may soar when allied with faith! How truly it should elevate us above the evils of this brief and busy existence to the conditions of that other life, when the soul, advancing ever to the source of light, and all perfection lives, adores, and reigns, in cloudless knowledge, purity, and bliss. Authorities. Delambre, Histoire de l'Astronomie; Arago, Histoire de l'Astronomie; Life of Galileo in Cabinet Library; Life of Galileo by Brewster; Lives of Galileo by Italian and Spanish literary men; Whewell's History of Inductive Sciences; Plurality of Worlds; Humboldt's Cosmos; Nichols's Architecture of the Heavens; Chalmers's Astronomical Discourses; Life of Kepler, Library of Useful Knowledge; Brewster's Life of Tycho Brahe, of Kepler, and of Sir Isaac Newton; Mitchell's Stellar and Planetary Worlds; Bradley's Correspondence; Airy's Reports; Voiron's History of Astronomy; Philosophical Transactions; Everett's Oration on Galileo; Life of Copernicus; Bailey's Astronomy; Encyclopaedia Britannica, Art, Astronomy; Proctor's Lectures. End of Project Gutenberg End of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 6, Renaissance and Reformation, by John Lord.